We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The snow began falling over Knox County, Maine. Just after 3 p.m. on January 8, 1998, a dry, biting kind of snowfall that didn't float gently from the sky but hurled itself sideways in the wind, turning U.S. Route 1 into a long white corridor of shifting visibility and ghost-like headlights. For the residents of Portledge, population 1204, the blizzard was the worst in nearly 2 decades. The harbor froze by nightfall, boats moored in a glacial grip, and the radio announced that all non-essential travel should cease. But for 36-year-old postal carrier Henry Dalton, the mail still had to move. He'd been with the U.S. Postal Service for 11 years, and in a town where everyone knew him by name, reliability wasn't just a virtue, it was his identity. His wife Caroline later told investigators that Henry had left their clapboard house on Sea Birch Road at 4:10 p.m., promising to complete the short rural loop before dark. The mailbag contained a dozen small packages and a stack of letters bundled by rubber bands, including a Valentine's card addressed in a child's handwriting that he'd smiled at before tucking into his satchel. By 6 p.m., when most of Portledge had shuttered its windows against the screaming Atlantic wind, Henry's route should have brought him back home. Instead, his postal Jeep, a white 1992 right-hand drive Cherokee with government plates, was later found half buried in snow near the intersection of County Route 7 and Mill Hollow Road. Engine still running, driver's door open, headlights dimmed by blowing snow. The time on the dashboard clock read 6:43 p.m. The driver's seat was empty. Deputy Nathan Rowe of the Knox County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene after a plow operator radioed in the abandoned vehicle at 7:12 p.m. Rowe's initial report described deep tire ruts, indicating that the Jeep had veered suddenly onto the shoulder before coming to a stop. There were no other vehicles' tracks in the immediate vicinity, just the steady accumulation of new snow swallowing the scene minute by minute. The postal satchel lay on the passenger seat, unzipped, with several envelopes scattered across the floorboards. The key remained in the ignition. Henry's heavy parka was still hanging on the driver's hook, and his gloves sat neatly folded on the dashboard. The discovery set off a sequence of calls that would transform a missing person search into one of Maine's most haunting cold cases. By 8:30 p.m., Sheriff Gail Merton had activated the county's volunteer search and rescue team, mobilizing snowmobiles and four-wheel drives to comb the surrounding woods. Visibility was nearly zero. The storm intensified, winds gusting to 40 miles per hour. Searchers found footprints leading away from the Jeep, identifiable by the uniform tread of Henry's postal-issue boots. The tracks extended approximately 50 yards into the woods before vanishing abruptly near a drainage culvert, erased, it seemed, by wind and drifting snow. Caroline Dalton was notified at 9:17 p.m. She recalled the sound of the deputy's knock over the howling wind, the sharp intake of breath as she realized something was wrong, and the image of Henry's thermos still steaming on the kitchen counter. He wouldn't have left his route, she told them repeatedly, disbelief tightening her voice. He's never missed a delivery in 11 years. He wouldn't just walk off. The next 48 hours blurred into a desperate, frozen haze. State troopers joined local volunteers. Coast Guard helicopters scanned the frozen inlets of Penobscot Bay. By the morning of January 10th, temperatures had dropped to -11, and frostbite cases began appearing among searchers. No trace of Henry Dalton was found. No footprints beyond the culvert, no torn fabric, no signs of a struggle. It was as though the storm had swallowed him whole. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery. Henry's wallet, containing 46 in cash and his ID badge, was still in his coat pocket inside the Jeep. The mail remained untouched, even the small parcels. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, no blood. Just silence and snow. Theories sprouted like frost. He'd slipped into the drainage ditch and been carried out to sea by meltwater. He'd become disoriented and succumbed to exposure. He'd been picked up by a passing vehicle and abducted, but none fit neatly. The open driver's door suggested haste, not confusion. The untouched keys and gloves suggested intention, not panic. By mid-January, the official search was scaled back. Sheriff Merton's tone hardened during press briefings, shifting from optimism to procedural detachment. At this time, she told reporters, we have no evidence of foul play. Yet among locals, that statement rang hollow. Portledge had secrets like all small towns. Old rivalries over lobster grounds, family debts, and the quiet resentments of an isolated winter economy. Some whispered that Henry had discovered something along his route, a letter perhaps, or a package he wasn't supposed to see. Others pointed to his recent dispute with a contractor who'd accused him of misplacing a payment envelope. Caroline rejected every rumor. Henry didn't have enemies, she insisted. He delivered mail. He brought people birthday cards and pension checks. He believed in this town. In the months that followed, the Dalton disappearance faded beneath layers of bureaucracy and snowfall. Spring came, the harbor thawed, and Route 1 filled again with tourists chasing lighthouses and clam chowder. Henry's Jeep was towed and impounded, then quietly returned to the Postal Service. Caroline placed a memorial plaque near the intersection where it was found. She kept his route map pinned to the kitchen corkboard, each delivery address circled in red ink, as if repetition might rewrite the outcome. The case file in Knox County Sheriff's Office would grow dust for years, labeled open, inactive. No one knew that inside that manila folder lay clues that future investigators, equipped with tools unimaginable in 1998, would one day use to unearth not just a disappearance, but a cover-up buried as deeply as the snow that night. 2 decades later, in 2021, when a state cold case unit reopened the Dalton file, technology had caught up to the mystery. Satellite imaging archives, digitized road maintenance logs, and forensic geolocation analysis would soon reveal that Henry Dalton's final route, and the people he'd encountered on it, were not what the official timeline claimed. What began as a disappearance in a blizzard would unravel into proof of deliberate misdirection, implicating figures who'd spent years cultivating reputations of trust and public service. But on that first night in January 1998, as the snow sealed every trace of human presence and the plow lights vanished one by one into the white dark, all anyone in Portledge could say was the same refrain whispered through the static of police radios and the cracked lips of search volunteers. He was right there a minute ago. Then he was gone. When the blizzard finally broke on January 11, 1998, the world that emerged from beneath it looked scrubbed of detail, as if every secret in Knox County had been sealed beneath a fresh white veneer. Sheriff Gail Merton stood beside the thawing postal jeep, her parka hood rimed with ice, staring at the place where Henry Dalton's footprints had stopped. It was a tableau of absence. No body, no weapon, no evidence of struggle, just a single human story interrupted mid-sentence. She wrote in her notebook, vehicle stationary, engine warm, no exit pattern beyond culvert, visibility near zero. Possible misadventure. Then she closed it and knew, even as she wrote the official words, that misadventure was a lie to make paperwork easier. The Maine State Police arrived the following morning with forensic kits and questions. They dusted the Jeep for prints, only Henry's. They photographed. The mail scattered across the passenger floor and bagged 3 letters for analysis after. Caroline mentioned that one envelope had been hand-delivered that morning by a stranger, asking whether Henry had a spare stamp. Nothing in the letters proved unusual. One contained a check to the local boatyard, another a child's drawing, and the third a typed note of condolence from a funeral home several towns over. Yet decades later, investigators would notice that the funeral home letter was post-dated by 2 days, as if someone had mailed it after Henry had already vanished. For Caroline, time lost its grammar. Days blurred into one long evening of police visits, casseroles, and whispered condolences at the Portledge Community Hall. She slept on the living room sofa facing the front door, convinced that headlights on the driveway would eventually belong to Henry. On January 18th, she began keeping a spiral-bound notebook of phone calls, names, and theories. It would later become the cornerstone of the cold case review. Her first entry read, "Deputy Rowe says tracks ended. Asked if maybe someone picked him up. But who would be out in that weather?" In February, melting snow exposed fragments of debris along County Route 7, a torn corner of a plastic mailbag tag, a cracked thermos lid, and 50 yards downstream from the culvert, a single boot. Postal issue. Henry's name stamped inside in black marker. Searchers scoured the creek bed, dredged the frozen channel, and found nothing else. The boot was logged into evidence as item 47A and photographed beside a ruler. The photo showed faint linear scarring on the rubber sole, scratches later identified as consistent with steel grating, not rocks or ice. It meant the boot had scraped against something man-made, perhaps metal steps or a ramp. At the time, no one cared. To them, it was one more meaningless artifact in a story that refused to cohere. By spring, official attention drifted elsewhere. Sheriff Merton retired. The state designated the Dalton file inactive, pending new evidence. Caroline wrote letters to the governor, to television stations, to the Postal Inspection Service. Most went unanswered. The only response came from the USPS regional office. We extend our sympathies. There is no indication of foul play or postal misconduct. She framed that letter on the mantel as a reminder of how institutions mourn without acting. Portledge returned to its rhythms. Tourists arrived in June, filling the inns and seafood shacks. The locals avoided talking about Henry except in lowered voices at Doyle's Tavern. One rumor claimed he'd fled debts. Another said he'd witnessed a drug shipment off the harbor pier. Yet the mail kept coming, delivered now by a quiet man named Jeff Nolan, who inherited Henry's route and drove the same Jeep after it was refurbished. Jeff told friends that the steering fell off near Mill Hollow Road, as though the vehicle resisted that stretch of asphalt. He requested reassignment twice. 23 years later, those requests would make sense. The cold case revival began in March 2021, when Sergeant Elena Reyes, newly appointed to the Maine State Police Cold Case Unit, opened a digital archive labeled Dalton 98 as part of a backlog audit. Reyes was 34, data-driven, and skeptical of ghost stories. She believed that every unsolved mystery was simply a failure of scale. The evidence existed, but no one had looked from the right altitude. What caught her attention first was a short memo from 2006 mentioning possible GPS overlap anomalies. The phrase meant nothing then. In 1998, rural mail trucks had no GPS. But by 2006, Postal Service fleet tracking had begun, and a regional supervisor reviewing route data noticed that Henry's recorded route, entered retroactively from paper logs, didn't match the pattern followed by subsequent carriers. There was a half-mile deviation along Mill Hollow Road that appeared on no official map. Reyes cross-referenced the coordinates with newly released satellite archives from NASA's Landsat program. The resolution wasn't perfect. These were 1990s images, grainy as old film, but by overlaying winter 1998 frames with present-day terrain, she saw something no one had. A secondary maintenance road, plowed only once that season, branching from Mill Hollow into a stretch of forest owned by the Nordham Aggregate Company. The company mined gravel and salt for road treatment. The road was decommissioned in 1999 after flooding collapsed a culvert, then erased from county maps. Henry's Jeep had been found less than 200 yards from its entrance. Reyes drove to Portledge that April. The Nordham property was still there, a fenced-off scar of frozen earth and machinery ruins. A caretaker named Bill Keating met her at the gate, suspicious of outsiders. He'd worked there since before the storm, as he put it, and remembered seeing plows that night. Not county plows, he said, company rigs. They were clearing access for the salt dome before the freeze. Big floodlight rigs loud as hell. Reyes asked who was driving. Keating frowned. Probably Tom Greeley. He was supervisor then, dead now. Heart thing, why? The detective's mind ticked through probabilities. If company trucks had been out during the blizzard, they were among the few vehicles that could have reached Mill Hollow Road. She requested payroll records from Nordham's defunct archives, which took weeks to retrieve from a regional storage facility in Augusta. When they arrived, the pages were brittle with age but legible. One-time sheet stood out. Thomas Greeley, overtime, January 8, 1998, 17:23 cow, Mill Hollow salt access. A handwritten note in a different pen added, assist HDW route blockage. HD could have meant Henry Dalton. Reyes' stomach nodded. She traced Greeley's employment history, decades of maintenance work, minor disciplinary actions for alcohol use, retirement in 2004, death in 2011. His personnel file contained an emergency contact, Martin Greeley, cousin, still residing in Portledge. Reyes visited him the next morning. Martin, a gray-bearded lobsterman with weather-carved hands, poured black coffee into chipped mugs and listened in silence. Tom never talked about that night, he said finally. After the storm, he came home soaked through, said he'd seen something he wished he hadn't. Wouldn't go near Mill Hollow again. Burned his uniform jacket in the yard. My wife thought he'd hit a deer. Reyes asked if Tom ever mentioned Henry. Martin nodded slowly. "Just once," said the postman didn't deserve it. "I told him to forget it before it ruined him." That statement reopened the case formally. Within days, a full forensic team descended on Port Ledge with ground-penetrating radar, drones, and cadaver dogs trained for frozen soil recovery. They focused on the decommissioned road leading to Nordham's old salt dome, a corrugated steel structure half-collapsed under decades of snow load. The radar detected anomalies, voids roughly the size of a human body beneath a gravel layer 5 feet deep. Excavation began under floodlights as curious locals gathered behind police tape, the same way they'd once gathered to search for Henry Dalton alive. On May 3, 2021, crews uncovered bone fragments, shreds of blue postal fabric, and a corroded metal badge reading Dalton H. DNA confirmed the identity within days. The discovery broke a silence that had lasted 23 years. Caroline, now 60, received the call while preparing for her evening shift at the assisted living center where she worked. She dropped the phone, then whispered, "I told them he didn't walk away." The autopsy yielded more questions than answers. The bones showed multiple fractures consistent with blunt force trauma rather than exposure. Microscopic residue on the clothing included traces of sodium chloride and diesel, consistent with contact from salt-spreading equipment. In simple terms, Henry Dalton hadn't frozen to death. He'd been struck and buried by a maintenance vehicle. Whether by accident or intent remained unclear. Reyes's analysis of road logs and equipment assignments narrowed the field to 2 operators working Mill Hollow that night, Thomas Greeley and Ray Pelham, a Nordham subcontractor. Pelham's name surfaced again in 1999 in connection with an insurance dispute after a warehouse fire, then disappeared from official records. A digital search revealed that he'd relocated to Massachusetts, changed his last name to Pelham with 1 L, and worked for a private snow removal firm until 2018. Reyes coordinated with Massachusetts State Police to locate him. They found him living in a trailer outside Lowell, terminally ill with emphysema, oxygen tank hissing beside his recliner. When asked about January 8, 1998, he closed his eyes and said, "The storm never stopped." Then softer, "We were told to keep the road clear." Tom hit something. Big thump. We thought it was a deer. He backed up. There was a man. I saw the uniform. According to Pelham, Greeley panicked. The snow was blinding, radio static constant. They'd been drinking coffee spiked with rum from a thermos. "He said nobody would find him till spring," Pelham whispered. He used the loader to move the drift. "Covered him with salt, said it'd melt clean." Pelham claimed he wanted to report it but feared losing his job and license. Tom said the county couldn't afford another scandal. Said they'd call it an accident anyway. Reyes recorded the interview, her hand steady though her pulse raced. The confession wasn't perfect, too late for prosecution, lacking corroboration, but it transformed the Dalton case from mystery to tragedy. Still, something gnawed at her. Greeley's note, assist HDW, route blockage, implied prior contact. How had Henry known to call for help from Nordham's crew? The answer lay buried in the paper trail of the U.S. Postal Service itself. Reyes subpoenaed archival dispatch logs from the Rockland Sorting Center, where all Port Ledge routes were coordinated. A faded carbon copy message dated January 8, 1998 at 5:42 p.m. read, "Route 12 obstructed, snowbank near Mill Hollow. Contacted Nordham Aggregate for plow support per request of Carrier Dalton." It bore the initials of the evening supervisor, SL. That supervisor, Samuel Loring, was still alive, now retired and living in Camden. When Reyes visited him, he answered the door in slippers and a flannel robe. His memory was sharp, his guilt sharper. "Yeah, I called Nordham," he admitted. Henry radioed in, said the drift was too heavy. Dispatch procedure was to notify Public Works, but county lines were jammed. Nordham owed us a favor, so I rang Tom Greeley. Next thing I know, Sheriff Merton's on the phone asking why our man's Jeep is empty. Reyes asked if he told anyone about the call afterward. Loring shook his head. "We were told to keep quiet. County wanted it buried, literally and otherwise. Greeley's brother sat on the zoning board. They said it was an accident. I didn't argue. Should've." When Reyes filed her report in June 2021, it spanned 184 pages and concluded, "Evidence supports accidental death and subsequent concealment by employees of Nordham Aggregate with knowledge of county officials. No indication of continued foul play after January 1998. Recommend reclassification. Homicide by negligence. Case closed. But the story didn't end with bureaucratic closure. Port Ledge woke again to reporters' vans, to television anchors speaking of justice delayed. Caroline stood by the harbor as divers retrieved symbolic handfuls of salt from the old dome site and scattered them into the sea. "He was just doing his job," she said into microphones. "That's all he ever did." The wind off Penobscot Bay carried her words out over the frozen water. The same wind that had once buried a man and his mail beneath a storm no one thought would ever give up its dead. By the time summer 2021 reached the Maine coast, the discovery of Henry Dalton's remains had already transformed Port Ledge from an isolated fishing town into the epicenter of a resurrected tragedy. For years, the Dalton disappearance had been a half-remembered ghost story, told by winter firesides. But now television crews camped along Sea Birch Road, and satellite vans crowded the parking lot of the diner where Henry once drank his morning coffee. Caroline Dalton, now a widow with 23 years of silence behind her, found herself the reluctant face of a media storm. Reporters asked what justice meant after 2 decades, whether forgiveness was possible, whether she believed in closure. Her answers were quiet, deliberate. "There's no closure when you bury a body twice," she said. Detective Sergeant Elena Reyes tried to avoid the cameras. She had no interest in fame. She was still trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. Pelham's deathbed confession had explained how Henry died, but not why it had taken 23 years for the truth to surface. The forensic team had confirmed the accident narrative, yet the cover-up remained a tangle of half-truths and silences. County archives contained no incident report, no internal memo about a missing postal worker beyond the sheriff's initial statement. Someone had made sure the paper trail ended as abruptly as Henry's footprints. Reyes spent her evenings in a motel overlooking the harbor, spreading photocopies across the bed, tracing signatures with a penlight like a cartographer mapping guilt. The key to everything, she suspected, lay in Nordum Aggregates' finances. The company had folded in 2001 under debt, but its last 2 years of operation showed large payments from the County Road Commission, payments labeled storm contingency. When Reyes obtained the ledgers, she noticed that the amounts doubled after 1998. It wasn't unusual for winter contracts to increase, but the invoices were vague, missing itemized breakdowns. Each was signed by Chairman Leonard Whitcomb, the same man who'd chaired the zoning board during the storm year and approved Nordum's permits. Whitcomb was now 83 and living in a coastal retirement facility in Belfast. Reyes visited him on a humid afternoon in August, the smell of seaweed thick in the air. Whitcomb sat in a wheelchair facing the window, hands trembling in his lap. His eyes were sharp despite the years. "You're here about the postman," he said before she introduced herself. "Everyone always comes back to that storm." Reyes asked whether the county had pressured Nordum to conceal the accident. Whitcomb's lips twitched into something between a smile and a grimace. "Pressure's the wrong word, Sergeant. Suggestion is more accurate." Tom came to us terrified. Said he'd hit a man. The sheriff wanted the road cleared before morning. Tourists due for the weekend. We all knew what it would mean for the town if word got out that county contractors killed a federal employee. "The papers would have crucified us." "So you buried him," Reyes said flatly. "We buried a problem," Whitcomb replied. The storm helped. No one expected to find anything till thaw. By then the story was old. Sheriff Merton filed it as missing. We paid Nordum extra for cleanup, and everyone slept easier. Except Caroline Dalton. Whitcomb's expression faltered. She came to every meeting for a year. We thought grief would quiet her. It didn't. Eventually she stopped coming. I thought that meant she'd healed. "She didn't heal," Reyes said. "She endured." Whitcomb nodded slowly. "That's worse." The interview confirmed what Reyes had suspected. Henry Dalton's death wasn't a mystery of evidence, but of conscience. Everyone involved had chosen silence over accountability. She returned to Augusta and compiled a supplemental report recommending posthumous disciplinary review of Sheriff Merton's actions and referral to the State Ethics Commission. It was largely symbolic. Most of the principals were dead or infirm, but Reyes believed records mattered, that official words could restore what official neglect had erased. Meanwhile, Port Ledge itself began to fracture under the renewed scrutiny. The same neighbors who'd prayed for Henry's return now found themselves accused of complacency. Editorials in regional papers questioned whether small towns fostered complicity by valuing reputation over truth. Tourists arrived in morbid curiosity, photographing the intersection of Mill Hollow Road as if it were a monument. The diner sold Dalton Root blend coffee. Someone painted "Mail Never Dies" on the old post office wall, half protest, half tribute. Caroline tore it down herself with a paint scraper. "He's not a legend," she told the reporter who caught her in the act. "He was my husband." In September, the State Attorney General's office issued a formal statement. The death of U.S. postal carrier Henry Dalton is officially classified as homicide by negligent concealment. Responsible parties deceased. Case closed, but Reyes wasn't ready to close it, not emotionally. There was still the matter of the anonymous letters. When the cold case team cataloged evidence from the 1998 file, they'd found an unlogged envelope sealed in plastic, labeled "Unrelated, Return to Sender." Inside was a single sheet of typing paper bearing only 6 words. "The road isn't where you think." No one had claimed responsibility. The envelope's postmark was smudged, but spectral analysis revealed a date: January 9th, 1998, one day after Henry vanished. The return address was a P.O. box in Rockland rented under a false name that traced back to a company dissolved the same year. Reyes had dismissed it initially as crank correspondence, but after discovering the hidden maintenance road, she realized the letter had been true in the most literal sense. Someone had known the real location of Henry's final route all along. The question was who. In October, she re-interviewed surviving members of the original search team. One name kept resurfacing: Deputy Nathan Rowe, the first officer on scene. He'd resigned from the sheriff's department in 2002 after what official records called personal reasons, and now worked security at a shipyard in Bath. Reyes found him living in a small cabin outside Warren, a satellite dish leaning precariously against the porch. He greeted her with the wary politeness of a man who'd spent years expecting ghosts. "I remember that night like it's happening right now," he said. "Wind so loud it sounded like the ocean in the trees. We found the Jeep, saw the tracks, then nothing. I radioed it in. Sheriff told me to stand by. Next morning, she said state police would take over. But they never did. After a week, she told me to stop asking questions. Did you send this?" Reyes slid a photocopy of the letter across the table. Rowe studied it, eyes narrowing. "No, but I know who might have." He hesitated, chewing his lip. "There was a guy on the plow crew, not Nordham, county maintenance. Name of Russell Pratt. He quit right after the storm. Said he was done with winter forever. Drove to Florida. I always thought he saw something." Reyes traced Pratt through employment records. He'd died in 2010, but his widow still lived in Tampa. When contacted, she admitted her husband had suffered nightmares about a man in the snow for years. He kept a box of unsent letters under their bed. She mailed them to Reyes. Inside were drafts, all identical in phrasing to the anonymous note. Pratt had known Henry's route didn't end where the map said. He just hadn't known what it meant. Fear had kept him from mailing most of them. For Reyes, it was another piece in the mosaic of silence that defined the Dalton case. A chain of people who'd almost done the right thing and convinced themselves that almost was enough. In November, a memorial service was held at the Portledge Town Hall. The wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of history. Caroline stood at the podium, reading from a letter Henry had written to her in 1995 when he first got the postal job. "It's a simple thing, delivering letters. You spend your days bringing pieces of other people's lives to their doors. Birth announcements, overdue bills, love notes, bad news. You start to believe the world's still connected by paper and trust." Her voice trembled. He believed in trust, and that's what killed him. After the service, as the crowd dispersed into the autumn wind, Reyes approached Caroline privately. She handed her the recovered postal badge, polished clean. "For your husband," she said. Caroline closed her fingers around it, the metal cold as memory. "Thank you, Sergeant. Will they remember him as a victim or as a man?" "Both," Reyes said. "And maybe that's justice." That winter, Portledge tried to settle back into quiet routine, but quiet no longer meant peace. The old Nordham Salt Dome was demolished in December, the gravel pit sealed and converted into a memorial park. A plaque read, "For those who kept the mail and the truth moving forward." Snow fell again, thick and relentless, but now it carried the weight of knowledge rather than mystery. Still, something about the official narrative unsettled Reyes. Late one night in her office, reviewing archival photos, she noticed a detail she'd missed. In the 1998 crime scene pictures, the Postal Jeep's rear bumper bore faint scratches forming a curved pattern, not from impact but from a tow hook. The angle suggested the vehicle had been repositioned after Henry vanished. Why move the Jeep unless someone needed it found in a specific place? The implication hit her like a gust off the Atlantic. The accident might have been real, but the staging was deliberate. Someone had wanted Henry's disappearance to look impossible, to ensure confusion. If Nordham's crew had panicked, someone higher had choreographed the cover-up. And the only person with authority over both the sheriff and the road commission in 1998 was the county administrator. His name appeared at the bottom of every emergency expenditure form. Robert Dalton. Reyes opened a new file on her computer. Alton, Oversight Inquiry. The Dalton case might have been closed, but beneath the snow of bureaucracy, something darker was still buried. Proof that Henry Dalton's death wasn't merely an accident concealed for convenience, but a conspiracy engineered to protect those who'd built their power on the illusion of a quiet town. And as the first storm of 2022 rolled across Maine, the wind carried the same whisper that had haunted Portledge for 23 years. He was right there a minute ago. Then he was gone. By January 2022, Portledge had learned to coexist with its ghosts. The town plows carved clean ribbons through snow each dawn. The harbor lamps flickered against the gray Atlantic. And Caroline Dalton's porch light still burned every night, an unspoken memorial to the man who never came home. But beneath the quiet routine, the Dalton investigation had entered a second life, one that moved in encrypted files, sealed subpoenas, and whispered phone calls from people who'd kept their secrets buried as long as the body itself. Detective Sergeant Elena Reyes had officially closed her report, but closure wasn't the same as completion. The more she studied the financial records, the more inconsistencies appeared. Signatures dated on weekends. Invoices approved hours before the county offices even opened. Payments authorized by a single name. Robert Dalton, county administrator from 1989 to 2004. At the time of Henry Dalton's disappearance, Dalton had overseen emergency appropriations and all contractor coordination. He was effectively the storm's accountant and its gatekeeper. Reyes had seen his signature a dozen times in the Nordham files, but something about the way it looped through the A struck her as familiar. She flipped through old documents and found the same handwriting on Sheriff Merton's 1998 incident summary, though that form should have been signed only by law enforcement. It was a small detail, almost invisible, but it suggested interference. Dalton had inserted himself into the official record of the disappearance. Dalton still lived in Maine, semi-retired, writing op-eds about coastal preservation for the Bangor Daily Chronicle. He was 72, polite in public, known for quoting Thoreau during budget hearings. Reyes arranged an interview under the pretext of historical research. She met him in his seaside home, a house so immaculate it felt curated, each nautical print aligned by laser precision. Dalton greeted her in a navy sweater, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "I remember the Dalton case well," he said when she brought it up. "Terrible business. We did everything we could at the time. Did you personally approve emergency funds for Nordham Aggregate the week after the storm?" "Of course. Roads needed clearing. Commerce doesn't stop for tragedy." Reyes slid a photocopy of the invoice toward him. "You signed this at 10:23 p.m. on January 8th while the storm was still active. County offices were closed. How?" Dalton's expression didn't change, but his thumb began tapping against the armrest. "We had contingency authority for off-hour emergencies." "The same authority that let you edit the sheriff's report?" she asked. His eyes flickered for the first time. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. The original report lists your handwriting in the margins. Phrases like limit scope and avoid state escalation." Dalton leaned back, exhaling. "You've done your homework. But you're chasing history, Sergeant. Everyone involved is gone. What good comes from tearing old wounds?" "Truth isn't a wound," Reyes said quietly. "It's scar tissue. It's what's left when the bleeding stops." He smiled faintly. Poetic, but naive. That night, Reyes wrote in her field log, "Dalton evasive, defensive, likely architect of suppression. Motivation unclear, political or personal." Over the next month, she combed through county archives, looking for connections between Dalton and Nordham. She found them in campaign donation forms. In 1997, Alton's re-election fund had received $12,000 in unitemized contributions, the largest from an address that once belonged to Nordham's registered office. The donation exceeded legal limits but had been split across multiple shell accounts. It was, in essence, a bribe disguised as community support. Nordham had been under investigation for improper waste disposal at the time. Dalton's death and the subsequent cleanup contracts had erased those liabilities. The cover-up hadn't just protected reputations, it had safeguarded profit. Reyes forwarded her findings to the Maine Attorney General's Public Integrity Unit. Weeks passed with bureaucratic silence. When a response finally came, it was cautious and anemic. Allegations reviewed. Statute of limitations precludes prosecution. Recommend historical documentation only. The phrase infuriated her. History was how powerful people buried crimes in language that sounded respectable. In March, a journalist named Evan Kress from a Boston investigative outlet contacted her anonymously. He'd obtained fragments of the same Nordham documents through a whistleblower. "We've traced the payments through a consulting firm called Eastwind Logistics," he said. "Guess who was on the board?" "Robert Alton," Reyes said immediately. "Exactly. Eastwind managed state infrastructure contracts. The Dalton cover-up wasn't local. It was systemic. Alton used Nordham as a test run. Kress's publication, The Record Line, planned an expose, but they needed corroboration. Reyes agreed to provide background anonymously. 2 weeks later, the headline broke. Maine official linked to 1998 postal worker cover-up. New documents reveal pattern of corruption. The article spread quickly, fueled by the irony that a man once celebrated for transparency had built his legacy on snow and silence. Alton's response came the next day. He called a press conference, flanked by attorneys, denying all allegations. "This witch hunt," he declared, "dishonors the memory of a good man by twisting tragedy into conspiracy." But behind his controlled cadence, Reyes noticed fear, the kind that comes from recognizing an investigation that won't fade with the next tide. Then something unexpected happened. Caroline Dalton received a letter postmarked from Bangor with no return address. Inside was a single key wrapped in wax paper and a note written in shaky block letters. "Harbor Storage Unit 12. He kept everything." Reyes accompanied her to the facility 2 days later under a warrant request. Unit 12 belonged to R. Alton, rented since 1999. The lock opened easily, the air inside stale and metallic. Stacked boxes lined the walls. County ledgers, reel-to-reel tapes, and file folders labeled Storm Records 98. At the center stood a rusted metal cabinet secured by a padlock. Inside, they found microcassette recordings dated January 8th and 9th, 1998, Sheriff Merton's radio transmissions. One tape captured a call logged at 10:12 p.m., hours after Henry Dalton's disappearance. "Merton, we've got the Jeep located. State assistance delayed. Alton. Understood. You'll handle locally. No state, no press. Copy?" Merton. Understood. What about the family? Alton. They'll get answers when the snow melts. Until then, the file reads missing. Reyes sat back, heart hammering. It was proof of deliberate suppression, coordination between law enforcement and administration to falsify reports. She forwarded the audio to the Attorney General's office. Within 48 hours, federal investigators opened a criminal review under obstruction and destruction of evidence statutes, which carried no limitation period. When agents arrived at Alton's home, they found him collapsed in his study, pulse weak but alive, a half-written statement beside his typewriter. It read, "We meant to protect the town. The storm demanded a story." Silence was easier. He was hospitalized under guard. The news electrified Maine. Local radio hosts called it the Blizzard Conspiracy. Talk shows debated whether small-town loyalty justified moral compromise. Portledge residents avoided cameras, ashamed and fascinated in equal measure. Caroline watched it all from her porch, badge in hand. "He was buried twice," she told a reporter. "Once in salt, once in lies." The federal case dragged through summer. Alton's health declined. He gave a single deposition before suffering a stroke that left him aphasic. The investigation confirmed that he had ordered Sheriff Merton to limit the scope and had authorized Nordham's cleanup payment in exchange for campaign donations. Technically, it was corruption. Morally, it was murder delayed by paperwork. Reyes found little satisfaction. Each revelation only deepened her understanding of how fragile truth was in a place where storms rewrote landscapes overnight. She spent nights rereading Henry's route map, memorizing the names of every household he'd delivered to. On one page, Caroline had once circled in red, Mill Hollow Crossing, danger and drift. The handwriting wasn't Henry's. It matched Alton's from the county invoices. He had annotated the map after the fact to construct a plausible route. Even the geography had been forged. By October 2022, the Department of Justice announced no further indictments. The case was closed once more, this time at the federal level. But one agent privately told Reyes, "You forced the record to tell the truth. That's all the justice time allows." In December, Snow returned to Port Ledge. The new memorial park where Nordham's Salt Dome once stood glittered under floodlights. Caroline visited daily, leaving a single letter in the bronze mailbox sculpture, a ritual offering. When Reyes asked what she wrote, Caroline smiled faintly. "Just the weather report," she said. "I tell him it's still snowing, but the roads are finally clear." That night, Reyes drove alone along Mill Hollow Road. The trees bent inward under frost, forming an archway of white silence. She parked where the Jeep had once stood and turned off her headlights. The darkness felt absolute. Somewhere out there, beneath layers of snow and history, lay the trace of a man who believed the mail would always get through. In the stillness, she whispered, "It did. Henry, it finally did." But as the wind lifted, carrying flakes across the empty road, she could almost swear she heard another voice, faint and distant, the echo of a transmission lost to static 24 years earlier. Route clear. Returning home. And for the first time in decades, the story of Port Ledge felt complete. Not because it had found closure, but because it had found witness. By the start of 2023, the storm had receded into history. But history was not done with Port Ledge. The Dalton case had become part of the state's collective folklore, a parable about silence, guilt, and the cruel efficiency of weather in erasing both footprints and truth. The federal inquiry had closed with Robert Alton's incapacitation, but the newly digitized evidence archive gave the case an afterlife online. People posted scanned photographs of Henry's Jeep, transcribed radio logs, debated Pelham's dying confession in comment threads, and built amateur reconstructions of his final route using 3D mapping software. Strangers thousands of miles away now walked virtual snowfields where once only Henry's boots had left a trace. For Caroline Dalton, the attention was both validation and torment. Every headline repeated her husband's name, but few understood the ordinariness of who he'd been. The world remembered him as a symbol. She remembered the sound of him rinsing coffee mugs, the weight of his boots on the porch. She still kept the same route map pinned above the table, faded red circles marking each mailbox. Sometimes, when the morning wind rattled the glass, she imagined she could hear the shuffle of envelopes sliding into them, steady and precise. Sergeant Elena Reyes had been reassigned to Augusta headquarters, where her desk overflowed with other cold cases. But the Dalton file stayed in her drawer, not because of unfinished work, but because it had altered her sense of purpose. The experience had shown her that truth wasn't an endpoint. It was maintenance, like clearing a road after a storm, knowing the snow would always fall again. She tried to let it rest, but in February she received a call from a digital archivist at the University of Maine. "We're processing the Dalton evidence set for academic release," the archivist said. One of the boxes contained a sealed envelope labeled "Return once roads are clear." It was misfiled behind the microcassettes. "You're listed as the contact of record." Reyes drove to Bangor that same evening, through sleet that blurred the highway into watercolor. The archivist handed her a plain brown envelope, brittle with age, the edges frayed by decades of handling. Inside was a single undelivered letter addressed to Caroline Dalton, postmarked January 8, 1998, the day Henry disappeared. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, angular, the kind of script that comes from years of addressing envelopes. Reyes hesitated before opening it. It felt wrong to read someone else's last words, but the chain of custody demanded it. She unfolded the page under the archive lamp. "Carrie, storm's getting worse but almost done. Roads rough out by Mill Hollow. Got to make one more stop. A package from the Nordham office. They said it's urgent for delivery before night. I told them they'd get their mail when the world ends if it keeps snowing like this. If I'm late, it's just the weather fighting back. Keep the porch light on. Love you. H." The ink had blurred where snowmelt must have touched it. At the bottom corner, faint graphite lines had been added later in another hand. "Recovered near Route 7, 03-1298. filed by Sheriff G.M. Reyes's breath caught. The sheriff had found the letter during the original search and hidden it, perhaps to avoid raising questions about Nordham's involvement. It was proof that Henry had contact with the company before he vanished, a quiet corroboration of everything the later investigation had revealed. But more than that, it was a voice from the middle of the storm, an echo cutting through decades of bureaucratic noise. She drove straight to Port Ledge that night, snow chasing her headlights. Caroline answered the door in a robe, surprised but calm. Reyes handed her the letter silently. Caroline unfolded it, reading slowly, lips trembling. When she reached the final line, she pressed the page to her chest. "He mailed it from the road," she whispered. He still finished his route. Neither spoke for a long time. Outside, snow drifted across the porch steps, soft as ash. In the following weeks, the letter reignited attention that had barely cooled. Local journalists wrote about it as Henry Dalton's farewell. The story reached national outlets again, accompanied by images of Caroline standing in the doorway with the letter framed behind glass. The Postal Service issued a commemorative dedication to fallen carriers who served in extreme conditions, unveiling a plaque at the Port Ledge post office. For a moment, the town's shame transformed into pride, not in the cover-up, but in the endurance of a simple man who believed the mail mattered. Still, Reyes sensed unease among older residents. She noticed it during the dedication ceremony, the way some faces turned away when the camera panned, the way others clapped too fast, as if drowning out memory. In small towns, truth never fully settles. It just rearranges itself around what people can live with. After the ceremony, a thin man approached her in the parking lot, his breath clouding the cold air. "You're the detective," he said. "Name's Cal Whitcomb, Leonard's son." Reyes remembered Leonard Whitcomb, the aging zoning chairman who had confessed to burying the problem. His son looked gaunt, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. "I found something when I cleared my father's effects," he continued. "A cassette. It's marked Storm Briefing, Jan 9. I think it's yours." He handed her a tape in a cracked plastic case. Back at her car, she played it on an old recorder. Static hissed, then a man's voice, Alton's, calm and bureaucratic. "Meeting summary, fatality confirmed. County responsible for containment. Sheriff agrees on single narrative approach. Family will be reassured when thaw permits, no press. Record this as contingency maintenance." A shuffle of papers, then another voice. Female, weary, almost whispering. "He was a good man, Robert. He just wanted to deliver the mail." Merton, the sheriff herself. Alton's voice again. "Good men die every winter. Our job is to keep the roads open." Reyes shut off the recorder. Even after the federal closure, even after the plaque and the letter, the sound of those words curdled everything. It wasn't just corruption, it was philosophy. A belief that utility outweighed humanity. She realized the Dalton case had never been a single crime, but an ecosystem of justifications. Every signature, every silence, every "we meant well," layered like snow until truth suffocated underneath. That night she walked along the Memorial Park, wind cutting sharp off Penobscot Bay. The plaque gleamed under streetlights. Someone had left a new envelope on the bronze mailbox sculpture. Reyes picked it up. It was blank except for 2 words printed in block capitals. "Still delivering." Inside was nothing but a square of folded white paper dusted with salt. Whether it was a tribute or a taunt, she couldn't tell. Spring came early that year. The thaw exposed what the snow had hidden. Rusted plow blades along the old Nordham site, fragments of Henry's mailbag stitching, and one final evidence marker that technicians had missed, a thin metal. Identification tag-stamped County Equipment 47A, the same designation as the boot photographed in 1998. It proved the connection conclusively. Henry had been struck by county machinery, not Nordham's. Alton hadn't just covered an accident. He had reclassified government property to shift blame. The revelation didn't change the legal outcome, but it clarified the moral one. Caroline chose to donate the tag, Henry's badge, and the letter to the Maine State Museum. He was a working man, she said at the exhibit opening. His job was to connect people. Maybe that's what this story still does. Reyes attended quietly in the back. When she left, a storm was moving in from the coast, the first heavy snow of the season. She pulled over at Mill Hollow Road one last time, stepping into the cold night. The forest was quieter than memory, but the landscape still carried its scars. The faint indentation where the old road had been, the slope where the plow once buried truth. She reached into her coat and unfolded a small piece of paper she'd kept since the archive. The line Henry had written, "Keep the porch light on." She read it aloud to the empty woods. "I did," she said. She did. We all did, eventually. Then she let the paper fall into the snow. The wind lifted it, carrying it into the trees, where it vanished like the last page of a long story, finally allowed to end. And yet, in that hollow of silence, she thought she heard it. Faint, human, impossible. The crunch of footsteps on snow, steady, deliberate, as if someone were finishing a route long overdue. The winter of 2024 was the kind of winter that made old stories feel close again. Snow came early and stayed late, turning the coastal towns of Maine into a monochrome dream of white and silence. Portledge had learned to live with the ghosts it had made, but ghosts have a way of returning when the weather turns familiar. The Dalton case, thought to be finally at rest, began to stir once more. Not with scandal this time, but with memory. The letter Henry wrote had become something of a local relic. Every February, on the anniversary of his disappearance, the Portledge post office reprinted it on commemorative postcards, stamped with a special seal that read, "Keep the porch light on." Tourists mailed them all over the world. The proceeds went towards scholarships for postal workers' families and for rural route safety improvements. The irony that a cover-up born of bureaucracy had birthed a fund to protect others from bureaucracy wasn't lost on anyone. Detective Sergeant Elena Reyes had transferred to the Maine Cold Case Task Force, where she was assigned to train younger investigators. But every year, without fail, she drove to Portledge on January 8th, parked along Mill Hollow Road, and walked the old route in silence. It wasn't ritual so much as maintenance, her way of keeping the road clear. On the 26th anniversary of Henry's disappearance, she made the trip again, but this time she wasn't alone. Caroline Dalton waited for her at the memorial park, bundled in her long gray coat, hair streaked with silver now, but eyes as sharp as ever. She carried a small parcel wrapped in waxed paper. "I thought you might want to see this before anyone else," she said, handing it to Reyes. Inside was a bundle of aged envelopes tied with string, letters Henry had written to her over their years together, but these had never been mailed. "I found them in the attic behind a false panel," Caroline explained. "Must have been hiding there since before the storm." Reyes opened one. It was dated December 1997, just weeks before the blizzard. "Carrie, the county's been hiring extra plow crews again. The new supervisor, Alton I think, keeps changing routes, says it's efficiency. I don't like it. Roads aren't what they used to be. Feels like someone's rearranging the map." Reyes looked up. "He knew," she murmured. "He saw the pattern before any of us." Caroline nodded. "He always paid attention to the small things. That's why he was good at what he did." They stood together in the drifting snow. Beyond the fence, the land sloped down to the remains of the salt dome. It was quiet there now, the only sound the hum of the distant sea under ice. In early March, the Maine Historical Society mounted a new exhibit titled The Dalton Files: How a Letter Solved a Storm. Reyes was invited to give an opening lecture. She spoke not about corruption or forensic breakthroughs, but about maintenance, the small, unglamorous work of people who keep records, deliver mail, and clear roads so others can move freely. "Every system," she said, "depends on someone who refuses to let silence win." After her talk, a man approached her, a graduate student from the University of Vermont researching historical weather data. "Detective," he said, "we were scanning old satellite records from '98 for the exhibit, and I found something you might want to see." He handed her a printed image, thermal satellite data of Grayston County from the night of January 8th. Across the blank whiteness of the storm, faint heat signatures traced the routes of snowplows. One of them followed Mill Hollow Road, turned sharply toward the old Nordham site, and then, bizarrely, looped back half a mile north. The loop formed a perfect oval, a route that shouldn't have existed. Reyes felt her pulse quicken. "Where exactly was this recorded?" "Here." The student pointed to a coordinate overlay. "It's right where your memorial park sits now." The implication hit her instantly. Someone, likely Alton, had ordered a secondary plow pass after the incident to erase whatever evidence remained. That loop was the deliberate burial run. The physical act of covering the truth had literally reshaped the geography. The realization didn't change the case's outcome, but it completed the narrative in a way no confession or court ruling ever could. The final sweep of that plow was both the ending and the beginning, the moment Portledge's history divided into before and after. By summer, Portledge had begun to transform. The town council renamed Mill Hollow Road to Dalton Route, and the old Nordham property became the Henry Dalton Center for Community Safety, a modest two-story building housing emergency management, postal training, and a small museum about rural infrastructure. At its entrance stood a bronze statue. Henry, coat billowing, mailbag slung over one shoulder, face turned into the wind. Beneath it was etched a single line: "He delivered, even when the world said he couldn't." During the dedication ceremony, Caroline spoke briefly. "Henry believed that every letter deserved to arrive," she said. "It took us 26 years to return his. I think he'd say that's right on time." Reporters asked about forgiveness, whether she had forgiven the people who buried her husband. Caroline's answer was simple. Forgiveness is just another kind of delivery. You send it out, not knowing if it'll reach the right address. Reyes watched from the crowd, standing beside Evan Kress, the journalist who'd helped break the corruption story. He whispered, "You know they'll turn this into a podcast next, right?" She smiled faintly. "Let them. Every retelling keeps the road open a little longer." That autumn, as tourist season waned, Portledge settled back into its rhythm of tides and snow preparations. The Dalton Center held evening safety workshops for new postal recruits. Caroline volunteered there, teaching basic survival tactics for blizzard conditions. Sometimes she'd end the class by reading from Henry's letters. One night after class, she found Reyes waiting outside. "You still come up every year," Caroline said. "You don't have to anymore," Reyes shrugged. "Maybe I do. Some cases never really close. They just change their address." They walked together to the edge of the harbor. The moon was rising over the water, a pale coin above the waves. Reyes took something from her pocket, a small brass key, the one that had unlocked Alton's storage unit. She held it out. "This belongs with the rest of it." Caroline accepted it carefully. "You think he ever regretted it?" "Alton, I mean. Maybe. Regret's another form of maintenance. Some people spend their whole lives plowing it away." When the next winter came, the first snow fell heavy and wet, coating the memorial park in a thick silence. A local teenager, part of a new generation that had grown up hearing the Dalton story in classrooms, recorded a short video for social media. It showed the bronze statue half buried in snow, the porch light from Caroline's house glowing in the distance, and a single postal jeep from the new fleet passing slowly down the road. The caption read, "Route clear. Returning home." It went viral overnight. The phrase became a slogan for the Postal Service's Rural Safety Initiative, emblazoned on jackets and training manuals. But in Portledge, it meant something quieter, a reminder that truth, like mail, can be delayed but not denied. Years later, after Caroline passed away peacefully at 76, her will instructed that she be buried beside the memorial park, close enough to hear the snowplows. Inside her coffin, the undertaker placed the last of Henry's letters and his old route map. Reyes, retired by then, attended the small ceremony. As the first flakes of a new storm began to fall, she stood by the grave and thought about all the invisible roads people travel, those of guilt, of duty, of love unfinished. When she turned to leave, she saw a young postal trainee placing an envelope on the headstone. It read simply, "Thank you for keeping the road open." Reyes smiled. "He'd like that," she said quietly. Then she walked back to her car, her footprints the only marks in the fresh snow, already softening as the storm closed over them. Behind her, the wind moved through the trees like the whisper of paper sliding through a mail slot. And if one listened closely, past the rustle and the sea and the endless breath of winter, one might almost hear a voice, steady, patient, familiar, route clear. Returning home,